Where do you think the culture, the Canadian culture, actually comes from?
Well, it's an interesting question. And when I do talks and I help people understand some of these things, that's ultimately where the conversation comes from. Where does this all come from? Why is it like this? And I think everywhere in the world, every culture is different. And I start a lot of my talks by saying, I don't think there's a perfect culture. I mean, there's always beautiful things about a different place, a different work environment, and there's always some challenges we've got to navigate, right? So Canada's no different. And, in the United States, they have their challenges as well. They're a little bit more direct, okay, than we are up here in Canada. But where did it come from? It's a curious thing, and it almost could be a separate podcast in itself, But essentially, the short history is this. When Canada developed, it had a very authoritarian government that was very... you could even go so far as to call it racist, the original John A. Macdonald government, okay? And they had a very hard line about how they wanted to do things. And so there was this long history of the nail got hammered down. If you went against the government, the nail just got hammered down. So what happened is the culture developed in such a way where you just kind of did what
You were told to do.
you were kind of told to do. And everybody saw that if you went out of step, you saw what was happening to Indigenous people in residential schools. You saw what was happening to Métis people. You saw what was happening to people that kind of decided to try to step out and try to present another way. Even though immigrants came from all around the world, when they started to get settled, they started to realize, so my mother, she's Scandinavian and her father was Ice-Atlantic and her mother's Norwegian. I might have that backwards in the moment here. But when they came over, they were Canadian. No, we don't speak Norwegian. We don't speak Icelandic. We don't carry those traditions. We're Canadian. The sooner you fit in. I have a neighbor who's from Holland, and he came over, and his uncle greeted him at the ferry. This was in the late 70s, early 80s, I imagine. And so my friend, the neighbor, started talking Dutch to his uncle. And he says, "No, not here. You speak English. This is it. You leave that behind." And this was a message a lot of earlier immigrants were faced with. And sometimes I meet someone, like I met somebody recently, and I said, "Your name, that sounds, is that an Irish name?" "No, I'm Canadian." And so earlier immigrants, when they came here, they started to see that I guess we got to kind of fit in. And, so Canada has its own culture, and there's a long history there with, conflict with Indigenous peoples, perhaps with Europeans. And eventually a culture just started to take root, but just started to become a Canadian way of thinking where you try to fit in and not resist, the status quo. And as a result, people started to dislike conflict. And as a result, people started avoiding conflict and maybe speaking more indirectly. And so this culture kind of started to arise where let's not have conflict. Let's avoid conflict. Let's not say anything negative that could prompt conflict. And so that kind of got built into the workplace culture too.
Mm-hmm.
People that could manage those conversations, people that could do that were more successful. They were seen as more valuable because they were able to, build those relationships with those principles in mind. And the challenging thing is it takes a lot of indirectness to manage those relationships. You got to read body language. You got to read what's not there. And if you come from a very direct culture where people say what they think, and they're not afraid of conflict, because that's part of the conversation. So if I say, "What do you think of that restaurant?" You say, "I think it's terrible." I said, "Why do you think it's terrible?" "Well, why do you like it?" I say, I think the service is good. The service is good. And we can go back and forth and we can have a conflict and we can still be friends. That's a direct culture conversation. And so if you were to move to a place where, and there's other indirect cultures in the world.
Oh yeah,
Canada's not the only
Japan,
right?
Absolutely.
And so Canada is one of them, and so it's kind of evolved in that kind of way. And so I'd say it's a complicated history.
Yeah.
It has evolved and it's there. And
like I just said before, it's it takes a while for newcomers to understand that difference and to pick that up.